Hey, it's Ed. We have 3 brand new podcast supporters I want to thank. Gabe Larson, Andrew Gregovich, and Suzanne Miller. These 3 folks signed up to support the podcast through Patreon, and if you want to learn more about that and other options, you can go to mountainandprairie.com/support. Another easy way to support the podcast that I greatly appreciate is leaving kind reviews on Apple Podcasts. A lot of folks, I think close to 600 people, have left very, very kind 5-star reviews for the podcast on Apple Podcasts, and it really helps with the visibility of the podcast. Some of you may remember, but the podcast ended up on the front page of iTunes for a few weeks, and I think a lot of that has to do with the kind reviews that you all left. So if you're so inclined and have 30 seconds, I would greatly appreciate a good review there. But otherwise, I just appreciate you all listening. Thanks so much for everything. Hey, this is Ed Robertson, and this is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast, where I introduce you to some of the innovative individuals who are shaping the future of the American West. I meet most of these people through my work in land conservation or through my hobbies and interests that revolve around spending time up high in the mountains. My guests include ranchers, writers, entrepreneurs, conservationists, athletes, artists, adventurers, pretty much anyone who's doing important work, has an interesting story, and loves the American West. My guest today is David Gessner. David is back for his 3rd appearance on the podcast, and this time we're discussing his brand new book, Leave It As It Is, A Journey Through Theodore Roosevelt's American Wilderness. Most longtime listeners will remember David's past 2 episodes. We discussed everything from Edward Abbey and Wallace Stegner to his daily writing rituals and his hand-built coastal writing shack. If you haven't listened to those first 2 episodes, I'd encourage you to do so. They're chock full of wisdom, good humor, and inspiration to fight to conserve the places you love. But first, take a listen to this episode. It offers up some timely insights into this current moment in history. In this episode, we spend the full hour discussing his new book and digging into the good, the bad, and the ugly of Theodore Roosevelt's legacy. As many of you know, I've read way too many TR books, and Leave It As It Is offers the most balanced, clear-eyed examination of the man that I've read to date. It's not strictly a biography or a historical examination of TR, although there's plenty of both within the pages. Rather, it's David's search to capture the best of TR's conservation ethos, to discard the worst, and to use the balance to build a new, holistic model for conservation and environmental justice. David melds together a confluence of ideals that acknowledges the wrongs of the past and sets an equitable, sustainable course for the future. During this time when we're rightfully reexamining many of our country's revered historical figures, Leave It As It Is provides a valuable, well-timed deep dive into the complexities of TR and his influence on conservation in the United States. Although an hour-long interview is no substitute for reading the book, I believe this conversation will give you a good taste of the fresh and unique perspective that David brings to the well-worn subject of Theodore Roosevelt. We start out by talking about the relevance of studying TR now, in the midst of this global pandemic, economic crisis, and social turmoil. David also explains the series of events that led him to begin writing the book, a multi-year project that took him from Bears Ears to Yosemite, with many stops in between. We talk in depth about TR's unacceptable views and treatment of Native Americans, some of the hypocrisies that define TR's life, and why David chose to stare these uncomfortable facts in the eye, rather than just make excuses for TR, as many biographers do. David talks about how TR's idea of the strenuous life has helped define his own life, and how writing this book has encouraged David to become more of an activist for specific causes. We also talk about the removal of the TR statue in New York, the idea of the confluence of ideals, and David offers up a long list of further reading on TR. As you'd expect, I loved every minute of this conversation, and I highly encourage you to read Leave It As It Is. It's a very important book that is perfect for this very important moment in history. I hope you enjoy. I feel kind of weird because we should be sitting around a ping pong table in Boulder, Colorado doing this, but here we are over the internet making the best of a weird situation. But first of all, I just want to tell you how much I love this book. I mean, I've read way too many TR books, and I feel like this one is one of my all-time faves, and it's it's so timely for where we are right now during this weird moment. And so I thought maybe the best place to start out would be, why TR right now? What is the value of digging into this guy from, well over 100 years ago, digging into his legacy during this very odd time that we find ourselves in right now?
Thanks, Ed. I guess I would answer that two ways, or I would break it into two parts. Why TR right now, and why TR when I started the book 3.5 years ago. They do have something in common, that the same president has been president during the time that I've been writing it. And in fact, it was in some ways a response to Trump's election. But as it turns out, the book coming out right now, I've been saying to friends, this is either the best or worst time ever to have a TR book come out. Worst because, his statue is coming down, which I support, and his buddy Muir just got dragged through the mud, which some parts of it I support. So the flaws of TR are going to be on full display. But best because, man, could we use him right now? Could we use a strong leader who respects science, who grew up not wanting to be, as you know, a statesman or a soldier so much as a naturalist, and somebody who, respects the science and was able, with his environmental issues and conservation issues, to articulate something that no one had even thought about before. As I say in the book, he not only articulated it, he created the arena in which it was thought. Who'd ever thought, put something aside, leave it as it is. And his ability to articulate that, I feel he could do the same thing with the climate fight. And as embroiled in the pandemic as we are right now, that's the bigger fight to come. And he would take on the fossil fuel industries just the way he took on the trusts and the railroads. So that's one reason he's so important right now. Mm-hmm. The other reason that he's so important right now is he wasn't afraid to get in trouble speaking the truth and bluntly speaking the truth. And I think that's something we can use right now, not fake bluntness like we're sometimes hearing, but the real thing. And so it's inspiring to have him, as my subject at the moment. And then, of course, there's something else. We have all these crises going in all these directions, and we are forgetting that the most consequential aspect, the most monumental aspect of Trump's presidency may be the destruction of the Antiquities Act. Mm-hmm. Right now, in a District of Columbia courtroom, the fate of the Antiquities Act is being decided. They are deciding whether a president can undo what a previous president has done. If that happens, all hell breaks loose. If that happens, anything goes. So that's another reason he's important right now, to remind people of the gains that were made and what was done then, and to not forget how vital it still is now.
And so for people who, I think most people who listen to this podcast have heard of the Antiquities Act in one way or the other, but for those who have heard of it, but it may not be completely clear, can you just give a kind of a thumbnail sketch of what that was and TR's involvement in the creation of it?
Yeah. A lot of people mistakenly believe he created it. He didn't create it. It was a law. Congress created it almost without thinking what they were handing over to this extremely progressive activist president. And I believe the word discretion is in the original act. And that's a word that's not commonly used with TR, and he got hold of it. And it allowed him to save land that was historically, scientifically, culturally valuable, and the land surrounding it. And these lands that he saved are called national monuments. And he started small, and by the end he was saving the Grand Canyon, and 800,000 acres of it. And it became a tradition. It's the most powerful tool a president has to save land without Congress's interference or help. And a tradition is to save that land often when one is going out of office. And one time, I believe it's Mount Olympus in Washington, one time Wilson reduced something that Roosevelt saved, and it didn't go to court. The one time the act went to court was over the Grand Canyon, and the sanctity of the act was preserved. So what's going on right now, is the result of Donald Trump reducing Bears Ears National Monument, saved by Obama, and Grand Staircase Escalante, saved by Clinton, by Trump's attempt to reduce these massively. And so the decision will be, can a president use the Antiquities Act power to take down what was saved by a previous president?
That's a great summary, and I want to talk about Bears Ears because that's obviously a huge part of your book. But first, I want to talk a little bit more about TR, just because, like, this moment in history that we find ourselves in, all the old rich white dudes that were born in the 1800s are being reexamined, as they should, and I'm reexamining a lot of them, and I think it's a useful exercise in a lot of ways. And TR, even before all this, was, he has his critics because he's a complicated man, and he's a man that could be seen as a hypocrite in many ways. He's a massive, bloodthirsty hunter in some ways, over the top, killing things. But then he played a massive role in saving a lot of wildlife in the U.S. And he's a trust buster, but he grew up in one of the wealthiest families in the United States. I mean, so you could go on and on. But I love in your book, I love that you look all the hypocrisy or the good parts and the bad parts. You stare them right in the face, and you don't back off, and you don't look away from the things the criticisms of TR. And so I think, could you talk about TR as the hypocrisy of TR, and then just kind of your thoughts on hypocrisy in the environmental movement?
Sure. Let me just start by backing up and saying what I love about biography. I go to biography selfishly. I go to pick through these lives and see what I can put to use in my own life. I don't look at TR and find out that he had twisted racial theories, later in life that I don't say, oh, that's cool, I'll use that in my life. What I go to him to see is the energy, the commitment to things, the excitement. Who's heard of a president saying, how fun the office is and how much he likes the big work? So there's so much about him that's contagious and exciting still. And at the same time, like you said, there are things you have to stare directly in the eye. Most prominently in this book is his attitude toward Native Americans, particularly since my focus was on Bears Ears National Monument. And I say at one point in the book, a standard move of biographers is to bring up something bad, TR or anyone that you're writing a biography about did, bring it up, make a quick excuse or move briskly on and, kind of forgive and forget. But with the Native American attitudes of TR, which really were, kind of manifest destiny, America first, drive to the other coast driven, and the Native people are in the way, there's no real excuse to make, because manifest destiny, the idea was already a half century old. So as I say in the book, if we give him credit for being ahead of his time environmentally, we have to criticize him for being behind his time, in terms of those attitudes. At the same time, people quickly see that, I know there's a high school in Ohio right now that's taking down his name off of of their high school building. But people have to understand that when he came back as a Bull Moose candidate, his platform would have made Bernie blush. He anticipated all the FDR stuff on women's rights, on labor, on his support of minorities. He was ahead of his time in that way. But he was a big fat hypocrite in a lot of ways too.
Yeah.
And he was messy. And personally, I think we're going to get through this cultural moment where we go back and we realize that messy people can be interesting and important too. And and we're going to maybe return to the more commonsensical approach we used to have, which was, hey, I don't expect people who live in a different time to have the attitudes that I did. I think I wrote a piece the other day, we don't expect people who lived before Newton to discuss gravity,
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so,
oh, yeah.
And then there's the simple common sense test, which is, how would I have behaved then? And how would that person have behaved now? And TR's politics were so progressive that probably the most twisted thing about him, which I've never really even gotten a handle on, are kind of the Nordic racial views that crept in kind of later on and don't really, the standard move now, like in the Washington Post piece on John Muir, is to say John Muir was associated with these people. And then the next line you say, and Hitler used those ideas to kill millions of Jews, which is just not a fair way to do it. But if TR were on the other side of World War II, there's just no way a reader, an empathetic person would have held on to those views. That's just my opinion. And so, we just have to extend a little empathy and realize that it's very easy to say from our perch, a perch that was partly earned by the progressive politics, 100 years ago. It's easy for us to say, oh, I would have behaved differently then. But so I think we're in a moment where what I just said could get me in a lot of trouble, but that's ridiculous. We should be able to have open debates and bring common sense and even humor and hypocrisy and the whole messy human, condition into this without it being just like, it's like we're amateur St. Peter's consigning people to heaven or hell. That's gotta stop. It won't, but it's got to.
Yeah. Well, you think, how could how can we figure this stuff out? And the only way I know to figure it out is conversations and talking about things and throwing ideas around. And maybe ideas offend some people and they don't offend others, but I don't see any other way other than open conversations where people can speak without being scared. I think, that's a larger issue, but
yeah.
I really love how you are so clear about TR's downsides. And then, you also talk about how you could be a hypocrite at times. You don't like the crowds in Yosemite, but there you are in your car in Yosemite. And I think that's just a very, a clear way of thinking about things that most people don't do for one reason or another. And there was one quote in there, and I'd read it before in some of your other work about your buddy that does work on the St. Charles River and his thoughts on hypocrites. Can you explain that?
Yeah, it's actually the Charles River in Boston.
Oh, yeah, sorry, yep.
And he helped green the Charles by creating bike paths, which a lot of people were against. But he realized, one thing Roosevelt talks about is walking the ridge. And the ridge on one side are just the evil, selfish people who money is their only, there are plenty of them out there who are just up to no good. But on the other side of the ridge are the kind of extreme dogmatic moralists. And he just feels that's great that they have these ideas, but they're never going to get anything done. And the ridge he walks is between those two things. And my friend Dan Driscoll walked a similar ridge. And he said, everybody's a hypocrite, particularly when it comes to the environment. We drive our cars, we heat our houses, and we say, oh, I'm a hypocrite, so I can't fight. But we need hypocrites who fight, Dan would say. We need fighting hypocrites, which sounds like a high school, mascot or something, the fighting. But one thing I was thinking about when you were saying that was early on, before I really launched on the trip that became the book, I made a little list of, kind of a what would Teddy do list. And it was, I jotted it down in my journal, and it was get into the wild, study birds, drink lots of coffee. That's one thing I learned in the book, was how much damn coffee he drank all day long. No wonder he was always yelling bully and everything. Get into spirited battles, speak his mind, read, learn about threatened places, write about those places, get in fighting trim, and last but not least, offend some people.
Mm-hmm.
So, we have to live in a little more of a, what he would call the arena, a little bit more of a rough and tumble place where we can have these conversations like we do in private with friends and with our spouses, and without getting all hysterical about it.
And so you mentioned when you got ready to take off on the road trip, and I think that's a really interesting story, just kind of how this book came to be, because you obviously, you're prolific in your writing. You got plenty of things to write about or that you want to write about. So can you give the backstory on why you chose this specific story? I mean, what caused you to hop in the car with your nephew and take off?
For me, as you know from past books, a big moment in my life was when I moved west when I was 30. I'd had testicular cancer. I was living back in my hometown of Worcester, Massachusetts, and I moved to Colorado and, started bawling when I saw the Rockies, basically. And during that time, I, as with so many of my friends, would head across the Continental Divide and down. I love how when you leave western Colorado, you really just drop into Utah, and would explore southeastern Utah. And really had some of my most intense kind of nature moments as I was getting healthy again, and spent time in the backcountry down there and got to know the place, not like a local, but just like a visitor. But, if I had to rank the places that are most important to me, it would certainly make the top 5. Meanwhile, of course, where I say in the book, while it was sacred in air quotes to me, it's truly sacred to many people, and including the Navajo and the 5 tribes that created the Bears Ears proposal for it to become a national monument, which was pushed to Obama and to Congress by many different people, but partly through a book called Red Rock Testimony, put together by Tory House Press and edited by Stephen Trimble and Kirsten Allen, that collected the writings of many people about their love for that part of the country. I call myself the token Easterner in that group. I was like, and so you had Native writers, you had Western writers, and I was the North Carolina representative for that book.
Yeah.
So that was passed. The two of them, Kirsten and Stephen, went to Washington and handed it to members of Congress and lobbied Obama. Regina Lopez White Skunk, a Ute member of the council, was also there lobbying. And before he left office, Obama declared Bears Ears a national monument, it was, for me personally, it's, your politics and your personal life are kind of separate. For me, it was the most intertwined I'd ever felt. And I just was like filled with excitement and pride that this place I knew was being saved. And I'd already kind of started going down the Roosevelt route. I thought, how cool that was that they'd used the Antiquities Act to declare it a national monument. And then, of course, with the new president, suddenly there were rumblings that was going to be taken away. Mm-hmm. And then the moment that really formed the book was October 27th, 2017, when then Secretary of the Interior Ryan Zinke, standing in front of a portrait of Roosevelt and claiming that he was a Roosevelt Republican on Roosevelt's birthday, declared that 85% of Bears Ears was going to be reduced and taken away. And so then I was just like, here I go. Mm-hmm. This isn't just some vague book idea. I'm going to get out there. And I wrote a proposal the next week. By January, I was back in Bears Ears. I had the good fortune of interviewing Regina first, and she gave me the whole Native American background of creating the monument proposal. And then I went into Bears Ears and climbed Bears Ears and started interviewing people and got down to the Grand Canyon where Roosevelt had said, leave it as it is. And actually, I don't know if you know this, but the book proposal was still kicking around. And I found out I sold it as I was walking across the Glen Canyon Dam.
I think you told me that a year or two ago. I think you mentioned that to me. I was thinking about that the other day, actually.
I was like, oh, the ghost of Abbey is with me here. And found out I sold the book to Simon & Schuster, which I was really excited about. And then I was like, okay. So that summer when school ended, because I teach at a university, I took my nephew Noah, who had just graduated from the University of North Carolina, Asheville, and we started our trip and we went up the East Coast, went to D.C., went to his home on Long Island, Teddy's home on Long Island, went to Harvard where he'd gone to school, and then headed west and followed kind of his trail through the West. And it all was kind of born out of it's appropriate, right, for Roosevelt, kind of righteous rage over having taken something away that we thought we had saved,
And, I keep mentioning how you look so clearly at TR's legacy. And I feel like one of the big themes of the book is you are finding the good stuff from TR, throwing out the rest, and then combining TR's good stuff with other good stuff. This confluence of ideals is how you refer to it. And you talk a lot about Bears Ears as how it's just this perfect case study of a confluence of ideals from Native American culture, combining some of their best ideals with some of the best of, no matter how flawed they may be, some of the best from America's ideals. Can you talk about that idea of confluence?
Yeah, well, obviously, one of the things that occurred to me, it seemed like this really great, clear idea. But then as soon as I got out west and started to talk to some Native people and some environmentalists, it was clear that there was a kind of schism here. I was bringing Roosevelt into a fight that he had a place in because of the Antiquities Act and national monuments, but also where he kind of didn't fit. There's a part in the book where I actually go up Utah's San Juan Hill, which I knew I had to climb because of Teddy going up San Juan Hill. Yeah. And I'm doing it with my guide, Lewis, who talks about Mount Rushmore, and his most hated figure there wasn't Teddy, it was Lincoln, because he had Sioux background, and Lincoln had been involved in a controversy with his people, but totally understandable rage at what we consider kind of revered figures. And Teddy's more complicated. He's not quite as revered, right? So my thing was, okay, we call it, Stegner called it America's best idea, national parks and monuments too. And there are problems with that ideal. And of course, one of them is a lot of the land, or all of the land, was originally the land of Native people, but some of the park and monument land also was too. So what I liked about Bears Ears so much was it was taking the best of the park and monument ideal and, as you said, like combining, creating a confluence with the Native American ideal. And part of that was the idea that Bears Ears would not just be a kind of museum, it would be a place for use, for the collecting of native plants, medicinal plants, and ritual. So I thought, wow, TR told this one story. Understandably, it was a dated story now in some ways, over 100 years ago. And now we have an opportunity to revise that story and make it a better story. So what was, I call the parks America's pretty good idea. Well, now we can take that and make it a better idea. So rather than say, oh, they were so wrong about, creating those parks. Well, first of all, not all the parks were, by the time they were creating the parks or monuments, they had long since fallen out of the hands of the Native people. And earlier, it's not as if it were going to be a choice between parks or, a native paradise. I mean, the white folks were rushing west with the rapacity of locusts, right? And It wasn't like it was going to be. So the parks actually did put a halt to that rapacity in certain cases. So it's more complicated. So I was like, let's take the best of what comes from the parks and put it together with the best of kind of native ideals and try to create something new. And ditto with Roosevelt himself, right? We're not. I mean, I've written about a lot of figures. I'm writing about Thoreau right now, and Roosevelt's one of the more difficult figures I've written about because he does have those flaws. He is, he's always ready for a fight. He's, like I said, it was a real eye opener when no pun intended, when I saw that he drank coffee from dawn till dusk. It's like, and in fact invented, as you know, the Maxwell House slogan, "Good to the last drop." So he's bristling along and pugnacious, but he also had a lot of good ideas and was forceful in putting those ideas through. So it's just as I'm trying to combine these two ideals, I'm also trying to take what's good about Roosevelt and open it up to the world we're in now. Something more inclusive, something more open, something hopefully more, big-hearted, basically. Though his heart was fairly big too.
Yeah, I agree, and like I said, I've read so many of these books, and I admire TR for so many reasons. But I'd say if I had to boil down like the reason, taking obviously it's a statement. He was a good guy. He's a family man. He had good intentions, no matter how that may have played out in some ways. But what I admire about him, and I think you do too, is his operating system. I sent you my masterpiece mug that I'm so proud of that says "Live strenuously," and I feel like if I can follow that idea of living strenuously, going hard, I feel like that's kind of been a life-changing ideal for me. Can you talk about how that squares with the way you live your life? Because you do the same thing.
Well, before I even started this book or started to think about it, I found myself scribbling down a note here at my desk where I'm talking right now. And it said, "It's not ease I'm after." And really that sums it up in a way. And it took me a while because, we're taught kind of that's the goal, to luxury. And it's taken me a while to kind of get to know myself over the years, to know. And Colorado was very helpful for this because I suddenly went from doing, I'd always played a lot of sports, but I went from doing workouts, kind of grudging jogs, to biking for 2 hours up mountains. And I found that I liked that more. And I liked the way my brain was more when I was doing that. And I had a professor there, Reg Sonner, at University of Colorado, who would talk about the pleasures of the difficult. Mm-hmm. Reg was a mountaineer and is a poet and essayist. And so the pleasures of the difficult were exciting to me. And I also always liked the idea, I don't know that I've ever said this in an interview or anything before, but I love the idea of sports and books together, and sports and books and the outdoors together. So there's like a moment where Roosevelt's with Sewell, his handyman at the ranch in the Badlands, and he's going down the Little Missouri. It's choked with ice, and they're chasing boat thieves that have stolen their boat. And he's in the back reading Anna Karenina. And, I'm like, that's it. That's what I want. I want to be, have those disparate things. That's one of the exciting things about him is he's, this guy who's like all action in a lot of ways. And when he first moves to the Badlands, tiring out horses and working 24 hours a day. And, and as I say in the book, I just love, and we can get into this, the Edmund Morris descriptions of that point in time. But then, he's also writing books at that time, and and I just find that for me, my brain does better when it's absorbed in these challenges. And like I said, it took a while to realize that. And it's a way of making life interesting for me. Mm-hmm. Even if I didn't get, I have a very good friend who lived in Laramie, who just died, Brad Watson, and great writer. The New York Times just had an obit,
I read
wrote
that.
a bit for him for his hometown paper. And a year ago, we were in Colorado, and he came down, and we did some day drinking, and another friend came over, and we started getting into this conversation about who had more finished, unpublished books that we'd actually spent years writing that didn't. And I think I beat him like 8-6. And obviously, I'd rather have my.
But who's counting?
Yeah. Look, I think I'd obviously, rather have my books be published, but there was a worth to being absorbed in them too.
Yeah.
Ones that didn't make it out there. And so, I don't know. I think there is something stimulating. Now, he's a little bit of a lunatic, Roosevelt, too, but there's something stimulating about kind of hurling yourself into life.
I think I've heard people, and I used to think this, that TR is maybe manic or maybe he was bipolar or something like that. But I found an interview. I'll send it to you. You may not have seen it. It's actually Conan O'Brien, who's a big presidential history buff, interviewing Edmund Morris. And O'Brien brings up that question. And Morris says, there's not a single report that anybody's ever had of TR where he seemed frantic or if you're talking to him, he is completely focused on you. He's completely locked in. He's still, he's calm, just this kind of almost otherworldly focus. Whereas somebody who's manic is kind of twitching around and makes other people uncomfortable. And so it's almost like TR just had this ability to focus. And I'm the same way as you. Sometimes I worry. I'm like, am I being manic here? But I just feel better when I just think of it as focused action, moving forward, working towards something. And I'm 42 now, and it took me a damn long time to figure it out. But, when I am engaged in focused action, I feel better. I'm a better person. And that's from TR. I mean, I read Rise of Theodore Roosevelt when I was 30 after I had a similar health scare to you. And it changed my whole perspective on that completely. Because I thought you're supposed to rest.
Yeah. Well, I would say that I won't repeat what you said because I agree with Morris. He was a great listener as well as a nonstop talker once he got going. Mm-hmm. But the other thing is when I lived in Colorado, we had a cat named Tabernash, and he was a very active, aggressive hunter. We had out through one time he brought a magpie in through the window. Yeah. But he also was a great napper. And I would suggest that, I don't want to make it seem like in that previous answer, I was suggesting I wake up and, go hurtling until I go to sleep at night. That would be more like if I were a cocaine using TR fan. These things pulse off each other. I always said of Tabernash, he was never kinder than after he killed. I'm a nap taker. I'm done with my daily work probably by 3 because I get up early and go. So it's all in how it kind of pulses. And you brought up Edmund Morris. It's been a real tough year. He died a little over a year ago. Bob Richardson, the great William James and Henry David Thoreau biographer, died. And I think, one thing about my books is I'm not a pro. I'm not a biographer. I call them, and I think I told you this last time we talked, biographical adventures. Mm-hmm. And part of that adventure is doing exactly what you did in reading biographies. And I remember first reading the Morris biography. I was probably younger than you were when you read it, but being so energized by it. And part of when I describe Roosevelt's time in the Badlands, I'm writing a little biography, but I'm also writing literary criticism. And it's about both McCullough and Morris's description of that time, David McCullough's book too, Mornings on Horseback.
Yeah.
The kind of contagious aspect to that writing, the momentum and the briskness of it, that's so exhilarating. And I think that's where a lot of people kind of start falling for Roosevelt. I say, I fictionalize. I have these interludes that I write kind of in the third person, the way a fiction writer would, and I describe his trip into Yosemite with John Muir. Mm-hmm. And where they wake up covered with 4 inches of snow, and they hike into a blizzard where the official report says the president was mired down in snow, which cracks me up to think of a president of the United States like running away from the press and the party he's supposed to be attending and hiking. But in the course of that, Muir says, he was partly fell in love with him. And at the end of that section, I say, I'm going to lose my biographer's guild card for saying this, but can I help it if I'm sometimes a little in love with him too?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, I lay Roosevelt's faults bare. I think they deserve to be laid bare. I think what we're doing right now culturally is very important, but I also was partly in love with the guy.
Yeah, it's, if you're the kind of person that is wired to feel good when you're doing things, it's hard to find a better role model. I mean, I heard Morris one time say he was an energetic sleeper. Yeah. And I like to think of myself that way. Well, you mentioned this at the beginning, and I'd love to get your thoughts on it. The removal of the statue in New York. I've got my thoughts on it, but I think we're probably pretty closely aligned. But what do you think about that?
Well, I'm for it. My line, I've written a couple op-eds, and my line is, let's take down the statue, but not take down Teddy. Mm-hmm. And he hated being called Teddy, by the way. We keep calling him Teddy.
Yeah.
He'll be really irked by this podcast that we're doing. So,
sorry to his ghost.
Probably call in, take over. But yeah, so I say, the statue basically represents the worst of him. And at some point in there, I said he's such an imperialist that he probably looks at England, at its glory as America's role model. And at one point, he actually thought we should take over Canada. So there. So that's the worst of it, and it deserves to be criticized. But then, of course, to compensate, the museum is renaming their Hall of Biodiversity after Roosevelt, which is so apt, And I think, and I say in the book, that we can accuse him of various prejudices, but the biggest prejudice of all, for me, these days for human beings is anthropocentrism, not being able to see beyond our human world and being so absorbed in it. And in a weird way, the pandemic has helped a little in that, like in a way, Leave It As It Is, the title of the book, applies to the pandemic, particularly Leave Bats As They Are, as David Quammen. When you rip into these places and kick up the microbiotic dust, you're leading to exactly what we got. So the pandemic is an environmental issue too. But Roosevelt's ability to see beyond the merely human, he's been, it's often, I think, falsely, they split him up with Muir and say one's a preservationist, the other's a conservationist. But when it came to like Yellowstone and preserving species, Roosevelt wasn't just doing it for the benefit of the people. He was doing it for the benefit of the world. And for somebody to be able to see that, which I believe is the most important thing we're going to have to see if we're going to survive over the next century, is extraordinary and is prescient. And so to me, that's a great kind of compromise. Take down the statue that's the worst of him and celebrate the Hall of Biodiversity that's the best. But the statue issues, I'm card-carrying liberal. I come down on the side of taking a lot of them down, particularly where I live, where a lot of the Confederate statues were put up after the Civil War. They were put up by the Daughters of the Confederacy 50 years later to romanticize the Civil War. And so these things have to go down. But we can't just then come in and say everybody who lived before us was bad. Mm-hmm. It just, you could go back. You can, if you want to start canceling, you'll never stop if you go, digging into people's lives. And so I'm glad that they're, and Roosevelt's relatives support it, his great-grandchildren, and there are groups that don't support it, and I get it, but I support taking the statue down.
Yeah, I think in general, this is kind of a dumbass way of looking at it, but it's a weird statue. If they went to Roosevelt Island in D.C. and tore that one down, I would not be happy about that, because I think that is a very accurate statue of TR, kind of leaning into it, looking real wound up, like he's, on his 18th cup of coffee. But, that statue, it's not, I bet TR would have liked it, because it makes him look like it makes him look, kind of like a Roman emperor or something. But I don't think it's an accurate representation of what I think of TR. And so to me, I was not bothered by that at all. But, we'll see if they continue to take down statues. But, it's complicated. There is no right answer. And just because I think something doesn't mean it's correct, it's complicated.
Can I jump in, Ed, with just one?
Please.
I don't know. It's not really even directly related, but I just like the fact that he was an effective, energetic, yes, aggressive liberal. Like he I think there was a Simpsons years ago when the two parties, like an elephant broke loose in a donkey, and the elephant, the Republican motto was, "We're simply evil," and the Democrat was, "We can't get anything done, or we're just ineffective." You know? And here was an example of somebody who, just was. I just love the idea of somebody coming in who takes no prisoners, but is pushing toward the very openness and progressiveness that is often associated with kind of idealistic ineffectiveness. Mm-hmm. So that to me, and also I think I hated Zinke. No offense, Ryan, if you're listening, but
I hope not,
because he was kind of a phony. He's like a phony outdoorsman. He was always calling himself Roosevelt Republican, where he was undermining the land that Roosevelt saved. But I do think that type, I'd like to see a politician who could reach out to the hunters among us and to the outdoors people, not just the environmental outdoors people, because, as I say in the book, it really is our common ground. The parks, the monuments, this is our land, and we share it, and it's one of the few places where we overlap. I never forget, like, I went down to the Gulf to write a book during the oil spill, and the hero of that book was also named Ryan, but this Ryan was a hunting guide and a conservative, big guy who called Obama my president, and we teased each other. But what we had in common was we hated seeing the soiling of the waters and the land during the Gulf. So I do think it's one of the only places where we potentially, have we being the disparate, split, divided populace in this country, have the potential common ground. And actually, Jason Mark just wrote a great piece about that for Sierra Magazine that came out a couple weeks ago too.
Oh, cool. I'll link to that in the episode notes so people can click through. I feel like this book again is so timely, because I feel like it really sets the stage to bring together the quote lefty environmental movement with the hunters and fishermen who are, more right wing. And, TR, I think a lot of times TR seems to be associated more with the anglers and hunters, but there's so much overlap between the two groups. And I feel like you really lay it out. And, who would have ever thought when you started working on this thing that we'd be in the position we are now when it came out? But I feel like it's more powerful than it would have been, which is wild. Who would have ever guessed? You need to, maybe you're psychic, start up a little palm reading deal.
Well, it's funny when you said that, because in the fantasy, you'd have both liberals who are environmentalists reading it and learning some stuff about TR, and both conservative people who like TR reading it and learning some liberal stuff. But maybe it's going to work the opposite way. Maybe the conservatives are going to read it and get to the earthy, crunchy part and toss it aside and go, "Who needs this shit?" Mm-hmm. And maybe the liberals are going to read it and go, "Oh, Roosevelt's no good," But I hope it's the first way and not the second way. The title "Leave It As It Is" was always the title. I just liked it. I was like, I like kind of yelling it, "Leave it as it is," like a grumpy old man or something. But a few months before the book, went into production, the the publicist, not the publicists, the marketers came around and said, yeah, this title's not going to work. It's not, we need to do something more about, like the elegant wilderness or something. So I wrote this long, thoughtful reply. And then the last line, of course, was leave it as it is. and miraculously they did. So that was great.
That is great.
And I didn't know we'd be where we were. But I did feel like the book originally, I've talked about the origins of the book. The book was kind of my long, thought-out response to Trump becoming president, because at the time, everybody was writing short, fast, the next day, what he did the day before kind of responses. And I wanted to go, well, that's true. I don't like those things, but here's a deeper reason. Mm-hmm. So I hope it does. As I said at the start, it's either the best or worst time for this book to come out. I hope it does strike a chord. Oh, and the reason I brought up the Leave It As It Is story, the title, was because, of course, when the pandemic struck, we had to postpone the book coming out. And originally they were going to put it out in March 2021. And that was another kind of fight I had to make. And my argument was for coming out before the election was the book had been this kind of long, thought-out response to Trump, and I didn't want it to come out after the election, even if that meant having to deal with the pandemic as far as book sales and readings and all that.
No, I think that makes sense. But like we were saying, before we started recording, I feel like people are now, here we are in August or almost in August, and people are getting used to this, the online nature of things. And so I think there's some great opportunities there to do this thing virtually and possibly even reach more people. And as hopefully you and I will be collaborating on something that I'll be announcing where we can have some readings. But you mentioned that this is not a straight up biography, and I'm so thankful for that, because I don't know that there's ever been a biography written, or maybe even a book written, that squares off TR versus Trump in a fight.
Yeah.
So you have this amazing scene where the two of them square off and fight. Who wins in a fight between TR and Trump?
Well, we've got to give Trump some credit for one thing, which is sheer mass. Right? I mean, this is a little too mean, but there was a superhero sci-fi character called the Blob, and he was hard to beat because, you can sustain a lot of, so he's a big guy. You got to give him that. We suspect, I think even his supporters suspect, maybe is a little cowardly. And that is one thing you cannot say about TR. So even if TR took a few blows early on, I think we'd have the Rocky Balboa factor. In fact, I think in the book early on when he's lifting weights, I call him like an upper crust Rocky here.
Yeah, definitely.
And he studies jiu-jitsu. He boxed in college. He famously knocked out the bully in the bar room in the Montana territories, I believe. It was like over the line of Dakota. Somebody's going to correct me, some TR. They're all out there lurking.
Yes.
Get anything wrong, you're in trouble.
I've been there. I get that a lot.
But, so I'm putting my money clearly on TR. Now it depends at what point in their lives. I mean, TR is fairly corpulent himself by the end, but I still think, he's still vigorous and active. And if you saw the photos of Trump trying to walk down the stairs the other day, I'm all in on TR on that one.
Yeah, it's hard to beat somebody that knows jiu-jitsu. And people probably don't know this, but he was blind in one of his eyes from getting popped in his eye in a boxing match while he was president.
President, yes.
Yeah. That's I love that scene. That was really hilarious. That's the thing people need to understand, is that you learn a lot in this book, but you also laugh a lot, as is the case with all of your books. And I just loved it. So, I mean, you've been writing about nature, the environmental movement, historical figures. I mean, you've covered this all over your career, and you crank these books out, and you're obviously extremely thoughtful about all these issues. But from the time you started out on your road trip until the time you sent the book off to the publisher, like, how are you different? Like what has changed in your outlook about the environmental movement, maybe even, yourself, your career as a writer. I mean, how did writing this book change you?
I guess I would say that it changed me somewhat the way I expected it to, partly because I wrote the book because of the point I was at in my life. I wrote the book because the way I get things done is to write a book about them. If I want, and my challenge to myself was to become not just a writer on these issues, but more of an activist. My time of writing it has coincided with me being department chair at my university, which is pretty much a thankless task, but it made me get a little taste of the fact that I'm not bad at doing things in the world, getting things done, and I want to take those skills and turn them toward environmental leadership beyond the pages of a book. And what better role model in terms of environmental, trying to inspire people and work as an activist than Roosevelt himself. So I knew that going in, that's what I was trying to prod myself to do. Now I haven't quite lived up to what I hoped to. The pandemic didn't help. My daughter, in the meantime, was becoming very involved in Sunrise, which is the Bill McKibben organization, 350.org for high school kids. And I brought, after we had a hurricane here, Hurricane Florence, and I invited Bill McKibben down to talk about climate change. I've become more overtly political, and I hope that continues. I used to think, separation of church and state, that my writing was the only environmental thing and that the other thing was a whole nother career. So if I have a few more years left, I hope some of my energy is diverted from the purely literary into a more activist role. I mean, I started, a couple friends and I, a couple professors and I at the university are working toward creating a center for climate change here. We're on the coast in North Carolina, a few inches above sea level. So it seems the right place to talk about climate. In fact, I think we have a hurricane or a tropical storm heading toward us right now that's supposed to get here on Monday. Oh, wow. So we're kind of on the front lines in that way. And so, and I also knew I'd be doing this, going out on the road. Well, not on the road, Zooming now. I didn't know I'd be Zooming. I thought I'd be driving to places and talking to like-minded people about environmental change. And so if anybody's listening who wants to get in touch with me, you can give them my email. Okay. As I kind of start to create things more. So, yeah, it was more just like, okay, you've written 11 books about this stuff. Maybe it's time to put up or shut up a little bit.
Who do you admire that's on the scene right now? I know you're friends with McKibben, and he's a pretty amazing guy. Are there any other activists that you admire?
Well, the one that just pops into mind, because I visit him late in the book, is Rick Bass. Oh, yeah. Where you have somebody who's, talk about prolific. I mean, he's got like 30 books, or more than 30 books, living up in Banff. But he's really kind of fought for the place where he lives in northern Montana. And it's, there's a lot of pressure on somebody who does that. It's not ease that matters. It's not a pleasant or easy thing, and you often come under fire with whoever you're fighting against. And so I guess I admire him for both fighting the fight and producing the books. And of course, Bill McKibben does that also.
Yeah, I need to read more Rick Bass. That's a definite hole in my in my all the reading I do. For some reason, I haven't done enough of his, so I'm adding him more to the list. So speaking of books, kind of to wrap it up, I can't believe we're already almost at an hour. Can you give some recommendations? First, maybe, obviously, everybody needs to buy this book and read it because it's great. Whether you've read, whether you've read all the TR books like me or you're brand new, I think this is it's a wonderful book. It's a timely book. It's a fair book. But thinking about TR, if somebody wants to dig into his life more. You've mentioned two. Are there other ones you would recommend?
Yeah, I can't believe I've gotten this far without mentioning Kathleen Dalton's, I believe it's called The Strenuous Life.
And, I haven't read that. That's the one I haven't read. And it now it's at the top of my list because you reference it a lot in this book. And I can't believe I haven't read it.
Yeah, it's 2002, kind of a reconsideration of Roosevelt. And one of the things she says near the end is that everybody tells the kind of origin story of him going from being the scrawny kid and to his dad coming in and saying, you must make your body, to kind of building his body and then going out to the Badlands. But she said maybe the more compelling, larger story is the story of somebody, born with a silver spoon in their mouths and who becomes this kind of traitor to his class as he starts to learn more about those less fortunate than him and his development as somebody who grows more liberal in his politics and more empathetic toward the poor and disadvantaged. So that's a really interesting one. The kind of opposite end of things, if I can find it here on my shelf, is I hadn't read it when I wrote the book, but Clay Risen, or I don't know if it's Clay Risen or Risen, who wrote a great book a year ago about the charge up San Juan Hill.
Oh, yeah. Crowded Hour.
Yep, Crowded Hour. He referenced in an op-ed I read a book by Joshua David Hawley, which is more academic, but really goes into those kind of twisted racial politics. So it's kind of interesting because if you put that next to the Dalton book, they kind of tell opposite stories about the later TR years. If you can be kind of, like Keats said, negative capability, keeping your mind open, it's interesting to see that you can tell these different stories about the same person. And then, one thing I would recommend, I mentioned Torrey House Press and Red Rock Testimony. They later took that book that they distributed to Congress and created Red Rock Stories, which is the book itself of all the Bears Ears stories. And then they did something very cool, which is they created a book that was edited by Jacqueline Keeler called Edge of Morning, which is about Bears Ears again, but it's native voices speaking for Bears Ears. One of the things I do at the end of the book is I have a whole recommended reading section, and part of it's about TR, but part of it's about Bears Ears. And an important part of the book that we didn't get a chance to talk to is connecting migratory pathways like the Yellowstone to Yukon corridor, and on American lands in general, where things like Ceremony by Silko, The Western Paradox by Bernard DeVoto. During the book, I read a great book, Housemaid of Dawn by Scott Momaday. So it's just fun to think of, and one of my favorites, Beyond the 100th Meridian by Stegner. Yep. And then, of course, there are the book, and then I have one on kind of ancestral Puebloans, Anasazi, and, among them are The Professor's House by Willa Cather, a great book.
Oh, yeah.
And then, for me, the fun ones to read by Roosevelt are the early nature-y kind of ranch life in the hunting trail, hunting trips of a ranchman, The Wilderness Hunter, where he writes some of the most winning nature writing I've read, just these kind of almost Hemingway-esque kind of short pictures of places and of the smells and tastes and touch. Of course, then he explodes into 4 pages of slaughtering everything in sight. And then he goes, like my cat Tabernash, I guess, and then he goes back to kind of these calm, beautiful descriptions. So I don't know. You have to kind of skip over that part, or unless you have a taste for it. Yeah. Because I think even hunters go, well, this guy's a little over the top. That's
one of my favorite kind of books are the books that I read, and when I finish, I have this long list of other books I want to read, and it gets me just hyped up to learn more. And not only does your book do that, but you actually do the list making for us. And at the end, there's just this amazing resource of all the different directions you can take this thing. And so I just greatly appreciate you writing it. And, it's, I love everything you write, and I love these conversations, and I appreciate your friendship. And, I'll look forward to promoting this book as much as I can, because I think it's very, very important.
We'll have to keep writing more books so we can talk more often.
No, we don't need books. I think we could, we can talk for hours no matter what. Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast, and thanks for listening to that particular episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Before you go, I've got 3 quick things. Number 1, if you like the podcast, please do me a huge favor. Either pass it along to a friend who may be interested, share it on your social media, or go to iTunes and give it a 5-star review. All those things would mean a lot to me, and they would really help to spread the word about the podcast. Number 2, if you've listened to many of these episodes, you know that I love reading and I love talking about books. Every other month, I send out a quick email with a few books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The subjects are varied, but they're pretty much all nonfiction with an emphasis on history, biographies, adventure narratives, and topics related to the American West. There are no sales pitches for ranches, no spam, no other kind of nonsense, just books. So if you'd like to sign up for the list, head to Mountain and Prairie/reading, or just go to Mountain and Prairie, and there's a massive tab at the top that says book recommendations. Click on it. There are a ton of good books that I've read. Some of the old email lists are on there. You can go crazy. There are a lot of books. And finally, if you know anyone I should interview for the podcast, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know. All my contact info is at mountainandprairie.com, and I'm on all the social media stuff, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, blah, blah, blah. So feel free to reach out. I'd love to have some recommendations and suggestions of interesting people I should meet. All right, that's it. Thanks for listening. Talk to you soon.